Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest Mobycon Academy webinar. We're glad to be welcoming you today for our webinar focusing on designing for slow streets and 30-kilometer zones. My name is Melissa Bruntlett, and I am the International Communications Specialist here at Mobycon, joined by my colleague Leonard Naut.
Yes, my name is Leonard Naut, a Manager of International Strategy for Mobycon here out of the Delft office.
So today we're really going to focus on how we can design for slow streets. It's been a big phenomenon over the last 18 months of many cities looking at how they can slow traffic to make more space for people, especially during the last little while when we've been trying to make more space for physical distancing. It's something that we've been doing, well, not me personally, but collectively we've been doing in the Netherlands for quite some time in terms of creating traffic-calmed environments that make them much more friendly to people on foot and on bicycle. And today we're going to look at two different profiles of a street, or two different locations. Streets within the neighborhood where Leonard lives in Utrecht, and then two streets in the city of Ottawa where they have done some minimal traffic calming to create these low speed areas, and then one with a little more permanent interventions. So without further ado, we'll get into just a few of the principles or elements to keep in mind when we are thinking about creating slow streets. First and foremost is that enforcement is futile. And so what we mean by that is oftentimes when we're thinking about slowing traffic, we think that putting up a sign will force people to slow down, but when in fact you can put up as many signs as you like, people will behave according to what they see around them. So while the best of intentions in this scenario are for people to slow down, and to be fair, some people are traveling at a slower speed, more often than not, design is what will help in terms of that changing of behavior. And that's done through design. So what you can see in the graphic here is using elements that force people to navigate the street a little bit differently, things that narrow intersections or crossings, traffic circles in the center of an intersection that force people to move in a more serpentine pattern, or even coming up to, as you can see in the photo there, putting in bollards or things to block through traffic for cars and allow for pedestrians and cyclists more easily. And then also taking into account what is the purpose of the street, what are you designing for? In this scenario you see a very typical woonwerf. So looking at this from a pedestrian zone, this space is meant for people to walk, to socialize, to spend time in, and so the environment has really been designed for that, and so that's something to keep in mind whenever you're thinking about traffic calming.
Yeah, and make sure that your design vehicle is the right type of vehicle that you actually want to use the street. Mm-hmm. And the second principle is very important. Width. Width is everything. If your street is wide, you'll get a gun barrel effect, and people will just focus on the horizon and thus speed up. So making sure that the traffic psychology works for the drivers. Few examples. This is one from Haarlem in the Netherlands, where they really shrunk down the street to 2 meters wide, which makes it actually quite hard for a Tesla to get through nowadays because their cars tend to get wider. But you shouldn't build your infrastructure accordingly. But as soon as people feel that the space is too narrow for their vehicle, the first thing they do is slow down. And while you can do that from the outset, if you have a new development, like a greenfield development or a new street, a full street rebuild, you can take that into account, but it can also be retrofitted, as you can see in this example. But you can use different methods and tools, obviously. Big rock on the road does wonders for your speed, because everybody will be scared to scratch their car on the side of this monster. Not necessarily has to be this big, like it can be a slightly smaller rock, but a big rock in the street is the best traffic calming. Here's another example from Utrecht. This is a little bridge where they want people to travel really slowly. It's a historic bridge, so they don't want to widen it, but they still want to have safe bike access while maintaining a level of car access through it. And you can see that the bollards are placed just a little bit wider than a car's width apart, which means that people are very, very scared to scratch their wing mirrors or their cars and thus travel at probably about 4 kilometers an hour, which is a perfectly safe sharing speed. So width is everything, and if you don't get the width you want, you can put as much signage and paint up as you want, but it'll help maybe a little bit, but it's not really going to get to a 20 mile or less or 30 kilometer per hour speed, as you can see by this example where they painted or they hatched off a lot of the asphalt to reduce the speed, but you can immediately see by this image there's nothing physically stopping you from speeding up.
The next principle is to start at the network level. So it's something that we focus on a lot in the work that we do in all the cities that we work in, is really looking at the city from a network level and thinking about how we want people to behave in certain spaces. So our 30-kilometer zones are more often than not our neighborhood level streets. And so the case study that we show from Utrecht is two parallel streets in the neighborhood where Leonard happens to live that both have a different treatment but are very much focused on dictating how they want people to behave in that network. So because this is a residential area, they wanted to, what was formerly through traffic streets, they wanted to reduce that or eliminate that. And so the treatments that you'll see in the video when we get there help to reinforce that. So the behavior historically for this area were that people would use the streets to travel through in this way, and also the other street heading in the opposite direction on the main road. And so by implementing some traffic calming measures, it helps to create much more of a calmed environment. And so the traffic in these spaces is very purpose driven. They are coming to stay or visit the people that live in this neighborhood. And that was done through things like modal filters, again, thinking from the network level, how do we want this space to behave, and ensuring that there is access for the people that live there or visiting people that live there, but eliminating that ability for through traffic. And you can see here, this is done with two different methods. One is a raised bollard, where you can only access it with a special key card because you're a resident, so you tap in, you can come through. Or the alternative is physical bollards, which are a lot more prevalent throughout most cities, and then definitely force people not to travel through and make space still, though, for the access for bicycles and foot.
Yeah. Funny story about the raising bollard. The only vehicle that I've seen going through there is actually the car that checks the parking permits in the neighborhood, because they always get to go through, but nobody else has access, except obviously emergency services and rubbish collectors and stuff. But the parking warden is the most frequent user of that bollard, which is quite funny. And then the last principle for today, the devil is in the details. Planning and designing for 30K streets is very different from roadway engineering. It's not all about buffer space and safety and adding more asphalt to the mix to make it safer. It's the other way around. It's more psychology based, but it also has a lot of, you need to really focus on the details to get it right. And some of those details are in the paving styles, for example. This is a road just around the corner from our site visit, which you can see has two different types of bricks laid. So they're both bricks, and bricks are the key ingredient that we use in Dutch streets to indicate a 30-kilometer-per-hour zone. Not necessarily the only way to do that, but it does slow down cars pretty effectively and efficiently. But you can see there's two different types, and that's done to alleviate some of the rumbling for bikes. So on the right-hand side, a different type of brick, different style of laying the bricks, which provides a much smoother surface, so an easier bike ride for the precious Utrecht cyclists. And on the left-hand side, a more rough, more rounded edge brick, spaced apart a little bit further, also gives you maybe a little bit more infiltration of rainwater. But that's done for the cars because you want them to have the friction and to have that tactile feedback when they drive too fast. And that's the level of detail that I think you don't see much in other countries. Well, I haven't seen it that much yet.
Mm-hmm. And it helps to increase the noise within the car as well. So not only is it that friction and the rumbling, but the louder it seems in the car, the faster psychologically you feel you're moving, and so it forces people to slow down.
Exactly. Yeah. Street design is mostly psychology and then a little bit of engineering to get it right. Yeah, perfect. And then in terms of detailing, speed tables, they're obviously an important ingredient, and you'll see some of them in the footage as well. But the type of speed table that you use can be quite important and quite a tricky balance to get right. On the one hand, you want cars to slow down, but on the other hand, you also want to provide for a pretty smooth transition for bikes, for example, and you don't want to have emergency services saying no to the whole scheme because the ramp to the speed table is too steep. So finding the right type, and there's a plethora of types of speed tables with different angles and different materials, is crucial to getting the speed and the comfort balance. correctly. Yeah, so these are the four principles, and you might be able to see some of this in action in the 360 footage that will start in a minute. Focusing on enforcement is not going to help you. The police will never enforce on a 30-kilometer street in the Netherlands because they'll say if you have speeding issues, the design is wrong. Width is important because if there's one thing, then drivers are scared of scratching their cars. Start at the network level. Don't just try and traffic calm a street that has a very important traffic function because you'll struggle. And get those details right, and that's where the rubber hits the road. But getting the details right is very important in making sure that the scheme is well received, well built, and it is maintainable and gets you to the right operating speed that you want. So, with that being said, let's do some traveling. We are starting today in the city of Utrecht. And we're starting with a treatment of a 30-kilometer-per-hour street. One is designed at 30. The second one will be designed at 15 kilometers per hour. And it's a nice way to show the difference between the two. They're not very subtle differences. You'll notice straight away that the design is very different. They're very short blocks, so there's only very short videos just to highlight some of those elements. So to start, the 30-kilometer-per-hour street. You can see it here. The footage is a little bit bouncy. I apologize for that. Don't get seasick. There's parking on both sides of the street, but the street trees are still implemented in between those parking bays, and that removes some of that feature that if there's hardly any cars parked, it becomes a very wide street and people will speed up. By putting trees in between the parking bays, you actually slow down the cars, even if there's no parked cars at the moment. Then the width, this is a one-way street, but there's parking on both sides, so they still left it relatively wide. If it was two-way, it would be marginally wider, but not actually that much. The recommended minimum is 4.8 meters for a two-way street, so that's actually, well, some American traffic engineers will be shocked.
And you've just ridden over a speed table there. Which becomes also a nice little pedestrian link between either side of the sidewalks as well, so that they don't have to worry about going to the end of the block to cross the street. Although it is a traffic calmed environment, they could pretty much cross anywhere. This gives an option for people, let's say, in a wheelchair or with a pushchair or pram, to be able to cross the street quite comfortably.
If they wouldn't have planted a tree.
If they wouldn't have planted a tree right there. But in some cases, it does help.
And especially at the intersections as well, where you have a raised intersection, we'll see that at the end. An even surface makes it much easier for wheeled pedestrians to get across. Yeah, for sure. Also relatively narrow parking bays, about 2 meters wide, so not necessarily catering to the widest of vehicles. In some streets, that leads to some antisocial behavior with two wheels being parked on the street, so that's something that's something to be addressed. And little details like getting the stormwater grates out of the roadway and angled the right way so your bicycle wheel doesn't get stuck in them. It's stock standard in the Netherlands, but it's a good practice to have that by default in your street designs, but also one of those design details that might get lost in the wider scheme.
And we can see here as well, there's two different colors. Because of the nature of where the bricks are placed, you've got the very, very red center area and then a different color treatment for the parking.
Yeah, and then a different color treatment for the footpath again. I think that's a nice, it adds a bit of detailing to the street, and just asphalt for the roadway, and then sometimes even just asphalt for the footpath just makes it so black and uniform and, well, in my personal opinion, really ugly. This gives it the next level of detail and texture and human skilled detailing and materials are being used. And then this is the raised plateau intersection, so no controls whatsoever, no give way signs, no markings, nothing. It's just a give way to the right by default, which makes it a very human-scaled intersection. Again, you rely much more on human interaction than on signage or on traffic lights even. So it's at a street design level, we try to design so you slow down and then you choose who gets right of way. You'll see that often bikes from the left even get priority or get given priority by cars because they're traveling at 20 kilometers an hour, and then it's much easier to come to the stop, let a bike go through, and then follow them. And this is that plateau intersection with no curb on the edge, so very easy to cross. I have crossed this intersection a great many times with the pram, and it's completely smooth and easy transition, so it's a very little barrier in terms of that. All right. Ooh, I don't know which button I pushed, but there we go. So with that being said, let's look at the Canadian equivalent of this street.
Sounds good. So the first street we're going to start with has had some, we've got double screen going on. There we go. It has had some moderate interventions in terms of traffic calming, but you can see it is a pretty standard North American street with your wide asphalt strip. There is parking on this street as well as the sidewalk. So this film footage was taken by our colleague Wayne, who happens to live in Ottawa as well. So he was very gracious to send it over for us. So the very first thing you'll probably notice different from the previous street is the width. So it is a much wider street. Even with the on-street parking, there's a lot of space. So it is a two-way street, but with a lot of space to move around. So you sort of lose those visual cues that force cars to slow down automatically. And this is what Leonard was referring to when you create sort of a gun barrel where people can just keep moving quite quickly. But they have attempted to put in some calming. So you can see the flex post just there and a planter box creating a little bit of space. So if there was two cars passing, the bike would still continue to have safe passage on this street. The flex post means that nominal damage to the vehicle if it happens to interact with said flex post. But it's an attempt to get started, and this is an example of with very moderate investment, you can start to build some traffic calming into your street without having to over-engineer it or re-engineer it.
Yep, and that planter board is quite, well, relatively easy to move, right? So if you see that it's still going too fast, push the planter board out into the roadway and see what happens. That's a nice iterative design step.
So we've got another flex post there, and on-street parking. That on-street does help to create that narrowing effect. So that is where you can use on-street to your benefit, and it's something that is done quite regularly in the Netherlands, but also with plenty of driveways as well. And here we come to a bit of a speed table. Very, like not a huge incline in terms of the slope. So it's very comfortable for bikes to continue to go over, but still creating enough disruption when you're in a car to know that you should slow down. Going too fast over this, regardless of your vehicle, is going to have some sort of feedback, possibly negative.
Negative feedback.
Yeah,
for sure.
And so continuing on, it's a moderate, as I said, interventions, a little bit of high-vis signage to make sure people see the planter boxes, but a good start for North American street.
What strikes me is that there's still what I would call road design elements in this street, and that's a different approach, right? In the Netherlands, you would never see the high-vis signage by default on a planter box. You're just expected to get an obstacle in your way when you're driving in a 30 kilometer per hour street. Obviously, that's not the case here yet, so I'm not saying it's a bad idea to put the high-vis stuff on it, because you would probably get hit. But it's a different approach, like relying more on the standard engineering stuff. You could also see the signage around the speed table. They're relying more on science and engineering elements than that they are on human behavior and like the whole environment being different, which is a hard transition to make from road to street if you have to retrofit it.
But then the nice thing is at the intersection here, although it is coming up to a major street, you do have a narrowing at the intersection, so forcing cars to slow down as they approach the intersection. Still the signage, as I said, it is a major street, so putting in a raised plateau here might not be exactly the right option, but the treatment that would likely be used here would be to actually create a continuous footpath and create a driveway entryway instead, which I think we see in the next video.
Yep.
Which would then help signify that cars coming into this neighborhood are in fact entering into a neighborhood street and to behave accordingly. As such, Wayne and his wife have a little bit of difficulty crossing this street. I think this is where we'll stop the video, but
takes a while.
It takes a while. But the other nice feature is they did take into consideration putting in the slope for still crossing. Although it's not a raised crossing or raised footpath, they have taken into consideration wheeled pedestrians or people with strollers and such can still get across comfortably without having to go up onto the curb and lift anything.
I only just realized this is a one-way street.
It is a one-way street.
Which is kind of shocking.
Right.
Because then it is excessively wide.
Yes.
You could easily have this as a two-way street. Anyway, so those are the simple 30 kilometer per hour, which is a pretty standard street design. That's that type of typology, width and treatment is stock standard. You can see it everywhere around the Netherlands. And then one example from Ottawa, where they've made the first steps into slowing down the street and are obviously clearly trying some treatments to reduce the speed and reduce that width. But they've done more, and both the Netherlands and Ottawa have gone the next step.
Mm-hmm. Before we hop to the next one, I did want to say, so although it is a one-way street, there is, because those flex posts are there, it is two-way for cyclists.
Right.
So that is the benefit, and that's why that treatment is there, is to make sure that cyclists moving against the traffic will have that safe passage to get by.
Right, that makes sense.
Yes.
Still excessively wide.
Still quite wide.
Makes sense.
Again, a start.
A start. Good start. Right, so now we go to the next street, which is this one. Is a woonerf. It is a different type of treatment. It has a different speed limit. It's 15 kilometers per hour maximum. And you'll notice some very noticeable differences in design and in layout of the street in terms of what kind of elements are used and what kind of experience it goes for. It has some of the same things, quite a lot of parking, still very high car ownership in these neighborhoods. And a little bit less in terms of planting, which is unfortunate. It's not, by no means the perfect woonerf, but there's a few things that stand out and that really nicely highlight the difference between a 30 and a 15 kilometer per hour street design. So the first one is the linearity. So you can see immediately that this car is parked at a funny angle, very different from the previous street where they're all nicely parallel parked. This is a 45-degree angled car park. Also one-way street towards us. But that shows that they're trying to break up the linearity of the street by playing with the car parking layout, and you can see that in the pavement design as well. So this street actually has technically no footpaths. There is a pedestrian zone, pedestrian safe zone, which is created along the frontage of the houses. It's often quite busy there with parked bicycles, planter pots, benches, but that's only there because people feel comfortable walking in the middle of the street, and that's the nice feature of this street. The footpath is really only necessary because you have too many cars or the cars are going too fast. If you get to a point where the volume is so low and the speed is so low, you really don't need footpaths anymore because they're only there because of the hazard. You took the hazard away. And that's what's nice about this type of street, and which it makes it possible to have the street curbless. So there's no curbs on this street, which is kind of handy if you're in the Netherlands and you want to drain it to the center of the street. You can do that, or you can play with that however you want to. And it leaves more flexibility and more room for planter pots, for example, here. The trees are limited, very limited, I would say, which is very unfortunate. They could have definitely played with some more trees, but that's where the parking probably came out on top in this instance. They still have a speed table, quite gentle one. It's a short block, so it's probably not super necessary, but an extra feature to make sure that the speed remains low. And you'll see that at the end they wiggle you out again. Is that my cat? I think that is definitely my cat.
So although there aren't a lot of trees on this street, one of the nice features of having this curbless design and creating a much more traffic calm space, people can walk in the street, is a lot of cities, Utrecht included, have implemented the ability for neighbors or homeowners to create little gardens in front of their homes. So you can see here that this particular home has put out a bench, they've got a couple trees planted, a second bench, some play space. But that very much is the characteristic of this type of street or the pedestrian zone, where we're trying to create a much more communal vibe. People will come out and interact with each other in the front of their homes, and aside from just spending time in the back of their homes. So it helps to...
Okay.
There's Howard. It helps to really, create a nice environment for people to be outside without the noise and the stress of cars passing through.
And the city actually builds your little front garden for free now, because they want to reduce the impermeable surface on the street. So they'll actively come out and build you a little vegetable plot, or like a little, it's very narrow, like 30 or 50 centimeters, but as long as you maintain it yourself, they will come and dig the hole and put the soil in. Then at the end, another little transition, so you can see that we swapped over again, so it's not a fully linear street. And then we seamlessly blend into the raised intersection again, where you give way to the right, which is also a home zone or a woon-erf, so there's no transition there, but to the left you can see that we transition down into a more regular curbed street that is 30 kilometers per hour, which is the key indicator. So that's the more extreme version from the Netherlands.
And now
it takes us back to Canada.
Yeah, now we head back to Canada, my hometown, or home country. Actually, I was born in Ottawa too, so there you go. Where they have taken a much more engineered approach to applying traffic calming to the street to create a 30-kilometer zone. So right away as we get started, we go over some speed tables. We've got planters on either side. You've got a space on the left-hand side there. If people wanted to pass through, if there happened to be a car passing, the cyclist can still pass through quite comfortably. Plants to help break up the visual plane to force people to, if you can't see so far ahead of you, you inherently slow down. But also you can see that linearity that Lennart was talking about in Utrecht, where suddenly now we're being forced to move in a more serpentine pattern. And this inherently will get people in cars to slow down, to behave accordingly. So we're using design to dictate behavior rather than signage in this space. The nice thing is that with building out these, instead of just having a planter box, but having a full planted boulevard, there's also rainwater catching areas, which help to alleviate some of the pressure on the area while still allowing for access in and out of driveways, which is obviously a common feature in many North American cities. So it is possible through design that we can allow for that continued access, but still create a much more traffic calm space. And even putting in planters in some spaces where they have identified likely that it was too wide. And so putting in those extra planters there helps to force drivers to slow down again and behave accordingly on what is also a one-way street.
Yeah, and you can still see that it's still it used to be a wide asphalt street with very little in terms of friction. But I still don't know how they did this, because this is quite innovative, and I think it looks great. I think this is a very desirable street now. But they still have that same plane of asphalt, and the rest is all just added on later. So they've really started with just the basic street that most other streets look like, and they've created this lush, almost garden, which I think is fantastic. They also kept that little walking path, right? A protected walkway, even though when you walk here, there's hardly any traffic. It's also one way. And it's really very comfortable to ride or walk in the middle of the street, but there is a protected lane for pedestrians, a protected zone where they can safely walk if they're a bit less certain of themselves walking in the middle of the street, or for children, for example. Yeah. Perfectly nice design. I do wonder what the fire department thinks of this street, but it's been here for a while, so
I think that they likely conversed with the fire department to find out what would work best for them.
I sincerely hope so. Yes.
And one thing I just want to point out, oftentimes when we look at these traffic calming elements in North America, we think about, how do we allow for access? For example, here where you have a parking lot for, I believe this is for the retail, but you also have a higher density apartment building there. It is possible to create those environments in tandem with each other. So you can have a two-way street becoming a one-way street and just force through design for people to change their behavior while still maintaining that access to those retail areas. So it is possible. They are challenges that need to be considered, but not insurmountable.
Yeah, and that's again like access streets. Streets are for access, not for through traffic. As long as you keep that in mind, like not every street needs to provide you a drive all the way through to the other side of the city. Yep. Some are only there to just reach your destination, which can be a parking lot or a house. So separating those out and then designing accordingly, and understanding that when you only need access, you really don't need speed, because you can get there, you just get there slowly, and that's absolutely fine. That's probably a
Yeah.
good realization. I like this.
Yeah, and the
treatment.
subtle little treatment at the intersection, it's not raised, but they have changed to pavers there and changed the treatment to signify this is a space for walking, so everyone entering into space knows that they need to behave differently because the road has changed.
Yeah, exactly. You really enter into the pedestrian realm almost. Yeah. So I think this is a fantastic case study in 30 kilometer or, well, probably 15 kilometer per hour street design in Canada, in Ottawa, where they have snowfall, they have emergency services, they have the North American context of transportation planning and engineering. So it's definitely possible, and the excuse, but we're not Amsterdam or we're not Utrecht, definitely doesn't apply here, because you could say we're not Ottawa, but then it's a slightly different story.
Yeah.
So I hope that gave you some inspiration for your own 30 kilometer or 15 kilometer per hour zones. If you have any further questions, I would recommend you to subscribe to the Mobycon Academy on academy.mobycon.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date with our upcoming Mobycon Academy webinars.
And if you want more information around traffic calming, there was a session done with Leonard and our colleague Mary in the US on the principles of traffic calming, which is an excellent resource that gets more into depth in terms of more of the planning and engineering around traffic calmed neighborhoods. Not just in terms of neighborhoods, but also main streets as well, looking at how you can apply some of these principles to your main street, for example.
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube,
Everything's
so
on
be
YouTube.
sure to like, subscribe. Next week, we will be back in studio. I will be here with a friend of mine, Maya Levi, who is a woman who lives in Delft and gets around using a mobility scooter, and we will discuss, I'm going to go on a tour with her and share that with you, and we'll discuss what it means to get around a city when you have limited mobility and what things to take into account to make sure that no matter who you're catering to, they can access the city at the same level.
It sounds like a really good session.
I look forward to it. And I look forward to joining you and having you join me then.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks.